Hey bananas, we think you're groovy. Hey bananas, we watch your movie. Yeah. Drive your tune buggies everywhere, just going crazy without a care. Hey bananas, we think you're groovy. We go. Hey, everybody's feeling groovy today because I'll tell you why. We've got a very special author. We've got Chuck Ruinson. We love him down here on the TV show, or the net show, The Buzz. Welcome to The Buzz, Chuck.
Thank you. It's always great to be on The Buzz. I mean,
and I
come
want
on,
to
what could
introduce
be
you
better?
to Robin B. She's the queen bee. She's buzzing too. She can't wait. She's done so much research on you. She knows more about you than you know about yourself.
Oh, my gosh. That's embarrassing.
Now, what I want you to do is, since we've already done the intros, I don't have to ask you if you're groovy, because I know you're already groovy. Now, excuse me, Robin. Now, there's your fantastic book, Some Fun Tonight, and there's 2 volumes. Now, while it's up, please tell everybody how they buy it, how it comes. There's a hardcover, 2 volumes. There's a soft cover. Tell everybody about it and where they can get it.
Okay, a couple of ways you can get it. If you want the cheaper soft cover versions, you can get those on Amazon, and you can buy them separately, Volume 1 and Volume 2 separately. If you want a signed hardcover deluxe edition, that's 2 hardcover books in a beautiful, attractive sleeve that is hand signed by the author, you have to go to my website, which is www.somefuntonight.com.
I'll leave it to you, Robin. Let's take away. Let's take it away.
He loves to get rid of my. I am not for sale, but if you put that book back up for a second while I'm talking plastic, that would be great, just so that we can read the title again. So it is Some Fun Tonight, a backstage story of how the Beatles rocked America, the historic tours of 1964 to 1966. It's a 2-volume set. All right, you can put that down now. You can show me again. Thank you.
Robin.
Hello. It's a 2-volume set. Actually, it's a 13-pound 2-volume set that details everything that you want to know about the Beatles tours, which very hard to find information because, of course, the internet didn't exist at that time. So I'm sure that gathering your research for this book, Chuck, was quite difficult. If you want to talk a little bit about your research.
Yeah, it was extremely difficult. You remember the old Mark Lewison book, The Beatles Live. I can't even imagine how hard he had to work to get the information of every show the Beatles did from the Quarrymen days until the final show in Candlestick. But it was a little bit for me. Now, the internet was invented when I started my research. So, yeah, I mean, it helped a lot, but there was a lot of misleading information on the internet, a lot of stories that had circulated for years that never occurred on the tours. And so I really, as a trained historian, I had to go and research the primary documents, which were the newspapers of the day, the different reviews of the shows, what they published, different documents that I had found that had been unearthed that no one had ever seen before, that kind of chronicled and detailed the kind of going-ons and the planning of these shows, what other cities they may have been considering, and of course all the memorabilia, with the tickets, the handbills, posters, tchotchkes, all that kind of stuff, which wasn't a lot back then. When you went to a Beatles concert, you basically could only buy a $1 souvenir program. And of course, I had to unearth hundreds of never before seen unpublished photos. A lot of the photos that had been taken of the Beatles on tour in North America over the years had been stolen, had been lost, had been in other archives that the archivists didn't even know existed, but we were able to find them. A lot of these photos are still in negative form. They've never, ever even been published into a photo. So that was really fun, trying to unearth all these things that have been hidden for literally decades.
And you're a collector, so you collected. I know you have tickets that were not used, which is astonishing to me that there are actually unused tickets for Beatles shows from that period of time out there. Whoever is watching this who didn't go to a show, what were you thinking? I mean, that's surprising to me. But were you a collector of items prior to researching this book, or did you really pick up steam when you started writing the book? And what other kinds of things besides the photographs and the tickets did you collect?
Yeah, so I was a collector well before I started writing the book. I started attending the fest for Beatles fans. Back then it was known as Beatle Fest. The first one I went to was in Los Angeles, California in 1979. I think the fest started in 74, so I was pretty early on. Of course, I didn't have a lot of money back then, so I, maybe got a bumper sticker or, something very cheap. But, as I had a little more that I could spend, I started collecting things. But unfortunately, in the Beatles world, there's so many things you can collect. You can collect the records. You could collect all the memorabilia, like the shampoo and the lunch boxes and all that kind of stuff. You could collect one of a kind type of items. You could collect tour memorabilia. And so as I started kind of amassing a small collection, I started to realize, like, wow, I really need to focus here. Like, what do I really like to collect? And I think the thing that I love that.
Nearly 40 years to get that poster signed to the Monkees. All four signed it. So I know all about collecting.
Yes, I love it. And so then I really decided, like, I really like the live concert history of the Beatles. I mean, let's face it, they didn't start their career in a recording studio. They started it on stages, whether it was Liverpool or Hamburg or the larger stages down under where you're at, Plastic, or even in North America. And so I focused on collecting tickets, really unused tickets, which Robin said are really hard. And the 64, some of those venues are extremely hard to collect because they were sold out. As you get into the later years, and 1966, they're a little easier to collect because those shows weren't sold out and they were held in larger venues. Promoters printed more tickets. But I think some of the things that I also collect that are kind of one-of-a-kind items that I really, really love is, I think my favorite piece is, I own a 1960 set list or playlist that was written by Paul McCartney right when he was turning 18. It was done for some shows that they did on the weekend at the Grosvenor Ballroom over across the Walsey, across the River Mersey. And, it's a list of about 30 songs, all of them just the things they cut their teeth on: Little Richard, Carl Perkins, Elvis, Chuck Berry. And on the list, there's one Lennon and McCartney original. This is from May, June 1960. It was the one after 909. And also on the list, Paul McCartney writes on it, "Don't forget to bring the Plex," which were the guitar picks, the words to the songs, and the strings, extra strings in case guitar strings broke on stage. So that's definitely one of my favorite pieces. It's how it ever survived, I'll never know. I mean, they weren't famous then. It was basically a garage band, as we call them today. How someone had the presence to take that from the stage and keep it for so many decades. I also have another set list that from 1963, right around the time "Thank You Girl" was released, from a show they did in Luton, England. And it's a Parlophone promo card. So what's also special about it is it's signed by all four Beatles that they gave to their driver that night for their daughter named Lorraine. And so all Paul had in his pocket apparently was the set list from the show that night. So that driver was able to get that. So that's just a few of some of the things that I've collected. We've three other friends of mine, we've actually put together a traveling exhibit that features even more rare one-of-a-kind items. We curated it and partnered with the Grammy Museum, and it's been on the road since February of 2014. It's called "Ladies and Gentlemen, the Beatles." It's about a 4,000 square foot exhibit full of one of a kind and basic common memorabilia, merchandise that kind of tells the story, mostly the American story of the Beatles from 64 to 66. We do have a pre-fame section with some really early stuff, but because of COVID, it's been sidelined for a bit. It was supposed to be in New Jersey this year, and we're hoping to be in Chicagoland starting next spring at a venue called Ravinia. It's the largest outdoor concert venue that, I'm not the largest, the oldest running outdoor concert venue in America. And they also have an exhibit hall there. So hopefully we will be back on the road, fingers crossed, next spring.
But I would imagine that a lot of these things appear in the books themselves. Yes?
Yeah, so in the books, I tried to picture all the memorabilia, and instead of picturing it very small, I would take almost a whole page of the book to display one performance contract or one rider, so everyone can read the words. They don't have to get a magnifying glass out to read things. But yeah, I feature every ticket from every show, a handbill if one was produced. There were very few posters that were ever produced for Beatles shows, only a few. Those are pictured in the book. There's documents that went back from Brian Epstein to Norman Weiss of New York at General Artists Corporation in terms of planning the shows, original documents that Brian looked at, that he pored over, that he tried to decide which cities he was going to have the Beatles perform in. And all of that is featured in the book. It's never before been published.
So you mentioned the writers, which I think, I actually was Peter Tork of the Monkees' personal assistant for a time, and I did some of the tours with them. So, I'm not a stranger to that world. And I feel like the writers can really tell you a lot about the character of the people. So, and I know, one of the stories, I listened to one of your interviews, and it really struck me that on the writers, they refused to play where segregation was in full force, which I just love, because how ridiculous was that period of time in our history? And I'm curious to know a little bit more about not only that, but some other things that were on their writers that you found out through your research.
Sure. So as you know, like concert writers today are very voluminous. They're 30 pages long. I don't know how long the Monkees was, but I'm sure it was more than a page. I don't know. Back in the Beatles, because they're a 60s group, they're kind of used to that. But now a major touring act, Paul McCartney today, he probably has a very long tour writer that specifies very specific things to be in his dressing room and the sound requirements and all of that. Back in the Beatles' day, the 1964 writer only consisted of about a page and a quarter. Even the last writer in 1966 didn't exceed 2 pages. And some of the demands were very simple. They demanded to have mirrors in their dressing room, a portable TV set, 4 cots, clean towels, 2 cases of soda pop. I mean, that was about it for the demands of course, there was all the other thing, 2 Super Trooper lights to, illuminate the band on stage, a high fidelity sound system. And of course, the most important thing, they needed to have uniformed police officers protecting them. In 1964, it was 100. And by 1966, Brian had upped that to 150. One of the things that's really surprising, though, in the tour rider is the clause that says the artist will not be required to perform before a segregated audience. And what's interesting about that is a lot of myths have circulated, a lot of false information that started or began right before the Beatles performed in Jacksonville on September 11th, 1964. For listeners outside of our country in the United States, Jacksonville is in Florida. It's located in the Deep South. Segregation laws were full in force, what we call Jim Crow laws. There were separate dressing rooms, separate places to get a drink, and all of that. I mean, it was segregation. Hotels, restaurants, everything was segregated. And so a lot of people believe and think that the Beatles would not perform in Jacksonville unless there was a segregation rider, a non-segregation rider in place. But in fact, the segregation rider began in the spring of 1964, well before the Beatles ever hit the United States. A couple interesting things were going on at the time. In March of 1964, a group was put together in New York City to have white artists kind of support a initiative that was brought by African-American artists to have venues not be segregated. So that started around March, right when Brian Epstein and Norman Weiss of General Artists Corporation in New York began to plan the tours.
So I just want to say, is that Nat Weiss?
No, the Nat Weiss was Brian's American attorney.
Okay,
not related to Norman Weiss. Two different.
Just wanted to correct that for myself.
Yeah, Norman Weiss was the vice president of General Artists Corporation out of New York. That was a talent agency, much like the William Morris Agency, or that booked talent. So anyways, when they started putting these things together, this tour rider, I mean, obviously Brian Epstein and the Beatles never had to worry about segregated seating in England. They'd never seen it. They'd never heard of it. I mean, they sang with African or black artists on stage in Liverpool. I mean, they were used to it. Down under Plastic, where they went to, there wasn't a segregation rider there. I mean, blacks and whites came to the concerts together. America was a different animal, though. And,
everybody could come. I just want to say I was 6 years old at the time. I saw it on television. And just to tell you something, if I may, I actually saw the broadcast live when they went to the Southern Cross in Melbourne. And this is true. I believe Channel 7 here in Melbourne were covering it, and it was live. And the big problem was they were scared because the Southern Cross Hotel has got huge glass at the front entrance. And all the fans were pushed up to the glass. So while the Beatles were upstairs coming out 5 Beatles, they were scared that those fans could get killed if that glass actually crashed, because at that time it was no safety glass. That was a real big concern.
Yeah. So back to the segregation issue. I mean, there was kind of this initiative that was kind of floating around New York City at that time. That's where Norman Weiss was at. There was also, this was prior to the Civil Rights Act passing in 1964. So in the spring of 1964, Jim Crow laws were still in effect. Segregation still existed. And Brian and Norman were planning these tours knowing that they were going to play Southern cities. As a matter of fact, there were about 11 or 12 Southern cities that were interested in having the Beatles, one of them being where they obviously played in Jacksonville. They did play in Dallas. They did play in New Orleans. But there are other cities as well. And 2 cities that they almost performed in was Montgomery, Alabama. That would have been on September 11th, right before the Jacksonville show. And on September 15th, they were going to perform in North Carolina. In Charlotte, North Carolina, and we know that Cleveland actually got that show. In planning those tours, my belief is that Norman Weiss and especially the GAC agents who worked the southern areas didn't have full confidence that, number one, the Montgomery, Alabama show could go off as a integrated show because, number one, there was a governor there by the name of George Wallace who in his inauguration speech just the year prior said, segregation now, segregation forever. And North Carolina was the same. I mean, North Carolina didn't even integrate their schools until 1970, I think. So those 2 cities were obviously struck off the list, even though Brian had wanted to perform there. So they're planning this whole thing prior to the Civil Rights Act. Obviously, the Civil Rights Act passes in July of 64. So therefore, all the Jim Crow laws are erased, but they kind of are slowly being erased. Segregation was laws and practices were still happening even after the Civil Rights Act had passed. So it was pretty bold of Brian. And this is the guy that probably doesn't get the credit. We tend to focus on the Beatles getting the credit for standing up to segregation. I think in all reality, Brian should receive the most credit. He was the one that worked on the contracts with Norman Weiss. He himself was gay. He himself was Jewish. He himself probably saw that and faced discrimination in his life. And it was the Beatles who supported Brian. We know as early as the spring of 1964 that the Beatles did know about segregation and that there would be some possible shows that would be trouble in the South. But even back in the spring of 64, there was a quote by John Lennon. I just written a new article about this. It should be appearing in a new music journal that Dr. Ken Womack is working on, which is a wonderful man, great historian. And there's a quote by John Lennon in the spring or early summer of 64 saying that the Beatles would never play before a segregated audience. So very interesting. The segregation contract was in place from the very first show in San Francisco, August 19th, 1964, all the way to the end in San Francisco on August 29th, 66, when they quit touring. Long answer to a short question.
No, I'm really glad to hear it. I'm sure that everybody out there is glad to hear that as well. It just gives the Beatles a whole new level of respect.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
For sure.
Now, Chuck, I just want to ask you now, you've done a lot of research, you've done everything. Now, from 64 to 66, can you tell me something you learned about the Beatles or their touring that nobody knows? You can do all this research, but what I want to know is, tell us something that no one knows from your research.
Well, I think it's
something you must have come across that's fascinating.
I think it's all in the book because there were, like I said, I told you at the very beginning, there was just a few myths that I had to bust. One of them was that there were, when they performed in Denver, because Denver in Colorado in the U.S. is about 5,000 feet above sea level, very thin air. And there were respected people on the internet, including National Public Radio, who would print things that would say, oh yeah, there were oxygen tanks on stage when the Beatles were performing. And after 2 or 3 songs, they would go over and take a hit of oxygen because of the thin air. Obviously through the photographic evidence, because we really never had any photos of Denver until I found them, that there clearly isn't any oxygen tanks on stage. Another thing that had been going on for years and years and years was that in Atlanta, the concert there in Atlanta in August of 1965, that a company that was kind of tasked to put together the sound system, they were called Baker Audio, they were out of Atlanta. They had been resting on their laurels for years and years and years, telling the story that they had invented feedback speakers, or foldback speakers as we call them. And they were on stage with the Beatles the first time ever that feedback speakers were used. So then the Beatles could hear themselves actually play. Well, that all sounds good. And when you listen to the live concert of the Atlanta show on bootleg, you can actually hear Paul McCartney commenting on the sound. And you can also hear John Lennon commenting on the sound, how great it is. So it would lead you to suspect, yeah, this was it. This was the first time feedback speakers were ever on stage. And even Brian Epstein wrote a letter to Baker Audio saying that the sound on stage in Atlanta was the best of the entire 1965 tour. So all the evidence is there, but was there any photographic evidence of it? And what's interesting is that in researching the book, I had never seen any pictures of the Beatles on stage in Atlanta. They were not circulating. They were not out there. And luckily, I'd contacted a very shadowy figure in the Georgia area who said that he had photos of the Beatles on stage. Of course, I asked him to send it to me. I told him about the project I'm doing, love to feature them. And he sent them, and I'm expecting to see foldback speakers on the stage. Well, when I finally got him and opened up the image, it was the standard stage setup in every stage they had performed at in the US, North America, from 1964 to 1966. Even the last show at Candlestick Park did not have feedback speakers. They were not invented yet. The sound technology wasn't quite there yet. If the Beatles could have held on till 69 or so, they could have done some interesting things with sound, but really what they had was their rudimentary stage setup their entire touring years. And so all the photos I'd ever seen of Atlanta, there just isn't any evidence of foldback speakers. Now I have to also say, okay, why was the sound so good then? So my theory is this, and that is that when the Beatles started the 1965 tour, they started where? New York Shea Stadium, 55,600 people. That's over 110,000 sets of lungs screaming for the Beatles, completely sold out, most every seat filled. And then the next stop was Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens. Now, Maple Leaf Gardens was a very old venue, been around for many decades at that point. Very rudimentary sound system. Probably didn't sound too good in an arena, especially with 15 to 18,000 screaming fans. Well, the next stop was Atlanta. Atlanta had just opened a brand new ballpark, Atlanta Stadium. In April of 1965, the Beatles would be there a few months later. So, you know, even though it was maybe a year older than Shea Stadium, hey, a year in technology and sound is a lot, maybe. I don't know. But the big difference between Atlanta and New York Shea Stadium is that at the Atlanta show, it was a 55,000 seat venue. And I'd say only. I think that was a huge crowd back then for a rock and roll show. 32,000 fans attended that show. So you have a little bit more of a deader air, a little bit more humidity in the air being in the South. And I think the sound traveled really well and the show went off great. So that's my theory. Someone can debunk me, but that's what I think.
It's striking to me because, you know, I'm thinking about how many photographs and how many bits of information you just had to study to be able to figure some of these things out. You know, like what would you say would be one of the most surprising things that you learned through your research, something that you didn't really expect to uncover?
I think one of the things was how little of news there was about, you know, this is the biggest kind of act of the ages at that time that's coming to your city. And there would be a little blurb, you know, in April about, you know, that city snagging the Beatles and this person's going to promote it and tickets go on sale, blah, blah, blah. You know, maybe a paragraph. And then what's striking is maybe the day that they show up, you know, there's, you know, a few cameramen there. It's not this, you know, like we see today with social media. I mean, there would have been hundreds of thousands of photos.
Definitely.
So look, I mean, the newspaper of the 2 or 3 newspapers of that city sent a photographer that day. They said, go snap some pictures of the press conference, maybe get one on stage. They would bring them back. They would find the best one, and then you just toss the other ones. I mean, it was like this band, you know, they were big, but they're coming through your city. The next day, there's maybe like a column written about the show. A lot of the songs listed are typed wrong. Just not a lot of information. No, not a lot of review, like a critical review of the show. No fan recollections. We kind of relied more on the teen magazines of the day that sent their reporters that actually got way better information. They actually, some of those reporters like Judah Sims, you know, they traveled with the band, sat in the bus with them, the airplanes. They got way better information. And luckily we had a few embedded reporters like Larry Kane and Art Schreiber who, you know, went along the whole way on some of these tours. But I think
correspondent, that guy's a legend. And I want to tell you, Chuck, if I may, your book is something that everybody has to read because it's like Ivor's book, On Tour with the Beatles. If you don't read these books, it's one thing talking about it, but it's another thing actually reading and getting into the crux of the matter. Because the research you guys do, I take my hat off to you because you can't explain everything, let's say, now in half an hour. So my suggestion to everybody out there is get the book. Now tell them again where they can get it.
Yeah, so if you want to spend a little less, you can always get the soft covers. It's a volume 1 features the 1964 tour. Volume 2 is the 65, 66 tour. You can buy them separately on Amazon, a lot cheaper, around $40 each. But if you want the hardcover deluxe edition, collector's edition, limited number, once they're gone, they're gone. It's packed in an attractive slipcase. It's hand signed by the author. The only place you can get that. You can get it on Amazon, but it's not going to be signed by the author. Plus, I'm running a holiday special now. The holidays are around the corner. These books were regularly $160. They're now $99, includes shipping. Only US only. You're going to have to pay a little extra shipping if it goes out of the country. But go to my website, www.somefuntonight.com.
Well, I'll tell you what, we know where some
direct from Chuck, for sure. Buy direct from Chuck. It would be a great present to give somebody for sure. What's on the horizon for you? What's next? What's your next project?
Well,
it took a long time. 8 years is
yeah, it took about 8 years. It came out in 2014. I'm selling out the remaining copies. I always kind of had a vision of maybe doing another same type of project as Some Fun Tonight, of doing every show the Beatles did outside of the British Isles. So that would start with Sweden in 1963 and end with the Philippines in 1966. But very difficult. If I thought Some Fun Tonight was difficult, this would be probably 10 times difficult. You're dealing with different countries, languages. The time has even further marched on. More people have passed on that were associated with the tours. Trying to find things, documents, and original memorabilia would be extremely difficult. So, maybe not.
understandable.
Now, I just want to say, you know where the title comes from, Robin, don't you? Some Fun Tonight. Let me explain. Do you know where the title of the book comes from? Robin.
I know where the book title comes from.
Where from?
Are you putting me on the spot right now?
Because I can tell you.
With your yellow submarine right above your head.
I can tell you. Do you know or don't you know? We haven't got all night.
I would love for you to enlighten me.
Okay. Paul McCartney used to sing the song, and in the line he goes, "We're going to have some fun tonight. Everyone's all right. We're going to have some fun tonight."
Okay,
that's where the title came from, didn't it, Chuck?
Yeah, so it came from a old Little Richard tune called Long Tall Sally. And the Beatles actually, many of their concerts, especially in America, in 1964 and 1966, they closed with that number on stage. That was the very last song the Beatles performed in Candlestick Park. August 29th, 1966, when they quit touring before a live paid public performance. That was the very last song, was Long Tall Sally. And of course, when Candlestick Park was demolished several decades later, Paul McCartney gave the final concert there. And of course, he's going to close that show out with Long Tall Sally, which he did.
And in 1964, all the Melbourne concerts, the closing show was that song, "We're going to have some fun tonight. Everything is all right." And he used to do the Little Richard, "Woo, we're going to have some fun tonight." See, I knew these things, Robin. Now, have you got any closing question?
Well, I could talk to Chuck all night, really. I'd love.
Well, we're going to have some fun tonight.
We are, yes. But I do think that what you need to do is order the book, because a lot of the answers are in that book, things that you never knew, things that you will never find anywhere else. He put 8 years of his heart and soul into this book, Some Fun Tonight, the backstage story, all about the tours. And of course, you want to go out and get that book. I know that I would love to give that book as a gift. I think it's a piece of...
I'd love to get that book too, but it's going to cost me double from here in Australia, unfortunately. But you know what? I'll tell you what, if you go on the net, I've seen the book for $55 Australian, and that's the soft cover, and I think that's the go for me. It's always better to get the book closer to home. Now, I just want to say, Chuck, it's been fantastic having you as a guest on The Buzz. And we're going to always have you again. If you write another book, of course, you're going to come back.
I do want to say this, though. When Chuck first came on, I was struck. Does anyone know who he looks like? Take a guess. Go ahead and type in an answer. He looks just like a celebrity.
We already asked him, and he gave us that answer. I don't think anyone.
The hint is Mork and Mindy.
Yeah, well, let him guess. But in the meantime, my good friend Charles Rosenau, can you read that out, please?
Great info. Chuck is Gunderful. Thank you very much, Charles. You're the best.
He's a wordsmith, and you've also had so many texts here from your good friend Kit.
Ah, I love Kit. She is the queen, as Dr. Womack tells her. She's one of the most wonderful Beatle historians we have. I love Kit to death. And, of course, we always need to comment on Kit's lipstick.
There you go. Now,
a wonderful person.
Instead of us
One
waiting,
of my favorites.
Instead of us waiting for the text, just tell me what people tell you who you look like. Because people say to me, I look like Al Lewis from the Munsters. And also I look like, I've been told by my wife, I look like Robert De Niro. That's another story. But if we were going to ask you, if people come to you and ask you who you look like, who do
I need to tell?
Say it?
I guess people tell me I look like Robin Williams.
You really do.
Maybe Steve Martin. I don't know. I've had a few of those. Hopefully I look like Chuck Gunderson. What do you think of that?
Yeah, you look like Chuck. Read that.
And my hair's gotten grayer since the photo.
Good morning, Vietnam. Okay. Well, there
yeah. Good morning, Vietnam.
All I want to say is thanks again. Wave goodbye to everyone. Stay there for a minute, Chuck.
I will.
Thanks for being on the buzz.
It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a buzz.
It has been a buzz.
And we're lucky we got Robin with us. She's Queen Bee.
You got it.
Robin.